Part second by Graf Leo Tolstoy. 1. The whole time he was lying in the gutter, Stepan saw continually before his eyes the thin, kindly, and frightened face of Marya Semenovna, and seemed to hear her voice. "How can you?" she went on saying in his imagination with her peculiar lisping voice. Stepan saw over again and over again before him all he had done to her. In horror he shut his eyes and shook his hairy head to drive away these thoughts and recollections. For a moment he would get rid of them, but in their place horrid black faces with red eyes appeared and frightened him continuously. They grinned at him and kept repeating, "Now you have done away with her, you must do away with yourself, or we will not leave you alone." He opened his eyes, and again he saw her and heard her voice, and felt an immense pity for her and a deep horror and disgust with himself. Once more he shut his eyes, and the black faces reappeared. Towards the evening of the next day he rose and went, with hardly any strength left, to a public house. There he ordered a drink, and repeated his demands over and over again, but no quantity of liquor could make him intoxicated. He was sitting at a table, and swallowed silently one glass after another. A police officer came in. "Who are you?" he asked Stepan. "I am the man who murdered all the Dobrotvoroff people last night," he answered. He was arrested, bound with ropes, and brought to the nearest police station. The next day he was transferred to the prison in the town. The inspector of the prison recognized him as an old inmate, and a very turbulent one, and, hearing that he had now become a real criminal, accosted him very harshly. "You had better be quiet here," he said in a hoarse voice, frowning and protruding his lower jaw. "The moment you don't behave, I'll flog you to death. Don't try to escape, I will see to that." "I have no desire to escape," said Stepan, dropping his eyes. "I surrendered of my own free will." "Shut up, you must look straight into your superior's eyes when you talk to him," cried the inspector, and struck Stepan with his fist under the jaw. At that moment Stepan again saw the murdered woman before him and heard her voice. He did not pay attention, therefore, to the inspector's words. "What?" he asked, coming to his senses when he felt the blow on his face. "Be off, don't pretend you don't hear." The inspector expected Stepan to be violent, to talk to the other prisoners, to make attempts to escape from prison. But nothing of the kind ever happened. Whenever the guard or the inspector himself looked into his cell through the hole in the door, they saw Stepan sitting on a bag filled with straw, holding his head with his hands and whispering to himself. On being brought before the examining magistrate charged with the inquiry into his case, he did not behave like an ordinary convict. He was very absent-minded, hardly listening to the questions. But when he heard what was asked, he answered truthfully, causing the utmost perplexity to the magistrate, who, accustomed as he was to the necessity of being very clever and very cunning with convicts, felt a strange sensation, just as if he were lifting up his foot to ascend a step and found none. Stepan told him the story of all his murders, and did it frowning with a set look in a quiet, businesslike voice, trying to recollect all the circumstances of his crimes. "He stepped out of the house," said Stepan, telling the tale of his first murder, "and stood barefooted at the door. I hit him, and he just groaned. I went to his wife," and so on. One day the magistrate, visiting the prison cells, asked Stepan whether there was anything he had to complain of, or whether he had any wishes that might be granted him. Stepan said he had no wishes whatever, and had nothing to complain of the way he was treated in prison. The magistrate, on leaving him, took a few steps in the foul passage, then stopped and asked the governor who had accompanied him in his visit how this prisoner was behaving. "I simply wonder at him," said the governor, who was very pleased with Stepan and spoke kindly of him. "He has now been with us about 2 months and could be held up as a model of good behavior, but I am afraid he is plotting some mischief. He is a daring man and exceptionally strong." Chapter 2. During the first month in prison, Stepan suffered from the same agonizing vision. He saw the gray wall of his cell, he heard the sounds of the prison, the noise of the cell below him, where a number of convicts were confined together, the striking of the prison clock, the steps of the sentry in the passage. But at the same time he saw her with that kindly face which conquered his heart the very first time he met her in the street, with that thin, strongly marked neck, and he heard her soft, lisping, pathetic voice, "To destroy somebody's soul. And worst of all, your own. How can you?" After a while her voice would die away, and then black faces would appear. They would appear whether he had his eyes open or shut. With his closed eyes he saw them more distinctly. When he opened his eyes they vanished for a moment, melting away into the walls and the door, But after a while they reappeared and surrounded him from three sides, grinning at him and saying over and over, make an end, hang yourself, set yourself on fire." Stepan shook all over when he heard that and tried to say all the prayers he knew, Our Lady or Our Father. At first this seemed to help. In saying his prayers he began to recollect his whole life. His father, his mother, the village, the dog, Wolf, the old grandfather lying on the stove, the bench on which the children used to play, then the girls in the village with their songs, his horses and how they had been stolen, and how the thief was caught and how he killed him with a stone. He recollected also the first prison he was in and his leaving it, and the fat innkeeper, the carter's wife and the children. Then again she came to his mind, and again he was terrified. Throwing his prison overcoat off his shoulders, he jumped out of bed, and, like a wild animal in a cage, began pacing up and down his tiny cell, hastily turning round when he had reached the damp walls. Once more he tried to pray, but it was of no use now. The autumn came with its long nights. One evening when the wind whistled and howled in the pipes, Stepan, after he had paced up and down his cell for a long time, sat down on his bed. He felt he could not struggle any more. The black demons had overpowered him, and he had to submit. For some time he had been looking at the funnel of the oven. If he could fix on the knob of its lid, a loop made of thin shreds of narrow linen straps it would hold. But he would have to manage it very cleverly. He set to work, and spent 2 days in making straps out of the linen bag on which he slept. When the guard came into the cell, he covered the bed with his overcoat. He tied the straps with big knots and made them double, in order that they might be strong enough to hold his weight. During these preparations, he was free from tormenting visions. When the straps were ready, he made a slip knot out of them, and put it round his neck, stood up in his bed, and hanged himself. But at the very moment that his tongue began to protrude, the straps got loose, and he fell down. The guard rushed in at the noise. The doctor was called in, Stepan was brought to the infirmary. The next day he recovered and was removed from the infirmary, no more to solitary confinement, but to share the common cell with other prisoners. In the common cell he lived in the company of 20 men, but felt as if he were quite alone. He did not notice the presence of the rest, did not speak to anybody, and was tormented by the old agony. He felt it most of all when the men were sleeping and he alone could not get one moment of sleep. Continually he saw her before his eyes, heard her voice, and then again the black devils with their horrible eyes came and tortured him in the usual way. He again tried to say his prayers, but, just as before, it did not help him. One day when, after his prayers, she was again before his eyes, he began to implore her dear soul to forgive him his sin and release him. Towards morning, when he fell down quite exhausted on his crushed linen bag, he fell asleep at once, and in his dream she came to him with her thin, wrinkled, and severed neck. "Will you forgive me?" he asked. She looked at him with her mild eyes and did not answer. "Will you forgive me?" And so he asked her 3 times, but she did not say a word, and he awoke. From that time onwards he suffered less and seemed to come to his senses, looked around him, and began for the first time to talk to the other men in the cell. Chapter 3. Stepan's cell was shared among others by the former yard porter, Vasily, who had been sentenced to deportation for robbery, and by Chauev, sentenced also to deportation. Vasily sang songs the whole day long with his fine voice, or told his adventures to the other men in the cell. Chauev was working at something all day, mending his clothes, or reading the Gospel and the Psalter. Stepan asked him why he was put into prison, and Chauev answered that he was being persecuted because of his true Christian faith by the priests, who were all of them hypocrites and hated those who followed the law of Christ. Stepan asked what that true law was, and Chauev made clear to him that the true law consists in not worshipping gods made with hands, but worshipping the Spirit and the truth. He told him how he had learnt the truth from the lame tailor at the time when they were dividing the land. "And what will become of those who have done evil?" asked Stepan. "The scriptures give an answer to that," said Chauev, and read aloud to him Matthew. "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him shall be gathered all nations. And he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in, naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me." Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, and fed thee? Or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in? Or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me not in, naked, and ye clothed me not, sick, and in prison, and ye visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye did it not to one of the least of these, ye did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Vasily, who was sitting on the floor at Chauev's side, and was listening to his reading the gospel, nodded his handsome head in approval. True, he said in a resolute tone. Go, you cursed villains, into everlasting punishment, since you did not give food to the hungry, but swallowed it all yourself. Serves them right. I have read the holy Nicodemus' writings, he added, showing off his erudition. And will they never be pardoned? Asked Stepan, who had listened silently, with his hairy head bent low down. Wait a moment and be silent, said Chauev to Vasily, who went on talking about the rich who had not given meat to the stranger, nor visited him in the prison. Wait, I say, said Chauev, again turning over the leaves of the gospel. Having found what he was looking for, Chauev smoothed the page with his large and strong hand, which had become exceedingly white in prison. And there were also two other malefactors led with him, it means with Christ, to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the people stood beholding. And the rulers also with them derided him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself if he be Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him and offering him vinegar, and saying, If thou be the king of the Jews, save thyself. And a superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, and Latin, and Hebrew, This is the King of the Jews. And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man hath done nothing amiss. And he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Stepan did not say anything, and was sitting in thought as if he were listening. Now he knew what the true faith was. Those only will be saved who have given food and drink to the poor and visited the prisoners. Those who have not done it go to hell. And yet the malefactor had repented on the cross and went nevertheless to paradise. This did not strike him as being inconsistent. Quite the contrary. The one confirmed the other. The fact that the merciful will go to heaven and the unmerciful to hell meant that everybody ought to be merciful, and the malefactor, having been forgiven by Christ, meant that Christ was merciful. This was all new to Stepan, and he wondered why it had been hidden from him so long. From that day onward, he spent all his free time with Chauev, asking him questions and listening to him. He saw but a single truth at the bottom of the teaching of Christ as revealed to him by Chauev, that all men are brethren, and that they ought to love and pity one another in order that all might be happy. And when he listened to Chauev, everything that was consistent with this fundamental truth came to him like a thing he had known before and only forgotten since, while whatever he heard that seemed to contradict it, he would take no notice of, as he thought that he simply had not understood the real meaning. And from that time, Stepan was a different man. 4. Stepan had been very submissive and meek ever since he came to the prison, but now he made the prison authorities and all his fellow prisoners wonder at the change in him. Without being ordered, and out of his proper turn, he would do all the very hardest work in prison, and the dirtiest too. But in spite of his humility, the other prisoners stood in awe of him, and were afraid of him, as they knew he was a resolute man, possessed of great physical strength. Their respect for him increased after the incident of the two tramps who fell upon him. He wrenched himself loose from them, and broke the arm of one of them in the fight. These tramps had gambled with a young prisoner of some means, and deprived him of all his money. Stepan took his part, and deprived the tramps of their winnings. The tramps poured their abuse on him, but when they attacked him, he got the better of them. When the governor asked how the fight had come about, the tramps declared that it was Stepan who had begun it. Stepan did not try to exculpate himself, and bore patiently his sentence, which was 3 days in the punishment cell, and after that solitary confinement. In his solitary cell, he suffered because he could no longer listen to Choev and his gospel. He was also afraid that the former visions of her and of the black devils would reappear to torment him. But the visions were gone for good. His soul was full of new and happy ideas. He felt glad to be alone if only he could read, and if he had the gospel. He knew that he might have got hold of the gospel, but he could not read. He had started to learn the alphabet in his boyhood, but could not grasp the joining of the syllables and remained illiterate. He made up his mind to start reading anew and asked the guard to bring him the Gospels. They were brought to him, and he sat down to work. He contrived to recollect the letters, but could not join them into syllables. He tried as hard as he could to understand how the letters ought to be put together to form words, but with no result whatever. He lost his sleep, had no desire to eat, and a deep sadness came over him, which he was unable to shake off. "Well, have you not yet mastered it?" asked the guard one day. "No." "Do you know our Father?" "I do." "Since you do, read it in the Gospels." "Here it is," said the guard, showing him the prayer in the Gospels. Stepan began to read it, comparing the letters he knew with the familiar sounds. And all of a sudden the mystery of the syllables was revealed to him, and he began to read. This was a great joy. From that moment he could read, and the meaning of the words, spelt out with such great pains, became more significant. Stepan did not mind any more being alone. He was so full of his work that he did not feel glad when he was transferred back to the common cell, his private cell being needed for a political prisoner who had been just sent to prison. 5. In the meantime, Mahin, the schoolboy who had taught his friend Smokovnikov to forge the coupon, had finished his career at school and then at the university, where he had studied law. He had the advantage of being liked by women, and as he had won favor with a vice minister's former mistress, he was appointed when still young as examining magistrate. He was dishonest, had debts, had gambled, and had seduced many women, but he was clever, sagacious, and a good magistrate. He was appointed to the court of the district where Stepan Pelajushkin had been tried. When Stepan was brought to him, the first time to give evidence, his sincere and quiet answers puzzled the magistrate. He somehow unconsciously felt that this man, brought to him in fetters and with a shorn head, guarded by two soldiers who were waiting to take him back to prison, had a free soul and was immeasurably superior to himself. He was in consequence somewhat troubled, and had to summon up all his courage in order to go on with the inquiry and not blunder in his questions. He was amazed that Stepan should narrate the story of his crimes as if they had been things of long ago, and committed not by him, but by some different man. "Had you no pity for them?" asked Mahin. "No, I did not know then." "Well, and now?" Stepan smiled with a sad smile. "Now," he said, "I would not do it even if I were to be burned alive." "But why?" "Because I have come to know that all men are brethren." "What about me? Am I your brother also?" "Of course you are." "And how is it that I, your brother, am sending you to hard labor?" "It is because you don't know." "What do I not know?" "Since you judge, it means obviously that you don't know." "Go on, what next?" Chapter 6. Now it was not Choev, but Stepan who used to read the gospel in the common cell. Some of the prisoners were singing coarse songs, while others listened to Stepan reading the gospel and talking about what he had read. The most attentive among those who listened were two of the prisoners, Vasily, and a convict called Mahorkin, a murderer who had become a hangman. Twice during his stay in this prison he was called upon to do duty as hangman, and both times in faraway places where nobody could be found to execute the sentences. Two of the peasants who had killed Peter Nikolaevich Sventisky had been sentenced to the gallows, and Mahorkin was ordered to go to Pensa to hang them. On all previous occasions, he used to write a petition to the governor of the province. He knew well how to read and to write, stating that he had been ordered to fulfill his duty and asking for money for his expenses. But now, to the greatest astonishment of the prison authorities, he said he did not intend to go, and added that he would not be a hangman any more. "And what about being flogged?" cried the governor of the prison. "I will have to bear it, as the law commands us not to kill." "Did you get that from Pelajushkin? A nice sort of a prison prophet. You just wait and see what this will cost you." When Mahin was told of that incident, he was greatly impressed by the fact of Stepan's influence on the hangman, who refused to do his duty, running the risk of being hanged himself for insubordination. Chapter 7. At an evening party at the Aropkins, Mahin, who was paying attentions to the two young daughters of the house, they were rich matches, both of them, having earned great applause for his fine singing and playing the piano, began telling the company about the strange convict who had converted the hangman. Mahin told his story very accurately, as he had a very good memory, which was all the more retentive because of his total indifference to those with whom he had to deal. He never paid the slightest attention to other people's feelings, and was therefore better able to keep all they did or said in his memory. He got interested in Stepan Pelajushkin, and, although he did not thoroughly understand him, yet asked himself involuntarily what was the matter with the man. He could not find an answer, but feeling that there was certainly something remarkable going on in Stepan's soul, he told the company at the Aropkins all about Stepan's conversion of the hangman, and also about his strange behavior in prison, his reading the Gospels, and his great influence on the rest of the prisoners. All this made a special impression on the younger daughter of the family, Lisa, a girl of 18, who was just recovering from the artificial life she had been living in a boarding school. She felt as if she had emerged out of water and was taking in the fresh air of true life with ecstasy. She asked Mahin to tell her more about the man Pelajushkin and to explain to her how such a great change had come over him. Mahin told her what he knew from the police official about Stepan's last murder, and also what he had heard from Pelajushkin himself, how he had been conquered by the humility, mildness, and fearlessness of a kind woman who had been his last victim, and how his eyes had been opened, while the reading of the Gospels had completed the change in him. Lisa Iropkin was not able to sleep that night. For a couple of months, a struggle had gone on in her heart between society life, into which her sister was dragging her, and her infatuation for Mahin, combined with a desire to reform him. This second desire now became the stronger. She had already heard about poor Maria Semenovna, but after that kind woman had been murdered in such a ghastly way, and after Mahin, who learnt it from Stepan, had communicated to her all the facts concerning Maria Semenovna's life, Lisa herself passionately desired to become like her. She was a rich girl, and was afraid that Mahin had been courting her because of her money. So she resolved to give all she possessed to the poor, and told Mahin about it. Mahin was very glad to prove his disinterestedness, and told Lisa that he loved her and not her money. Such proof of his innate nobility made him admire himself greatly. Mahin helped Lisa to carry out her decision. And the more he did so, the more he came to realize the new world of Lisa's spiritual ambitions, quite unknown to him heretofore. Chapter 8. All were silent in the common cell. Stepan was lying in his bed, but was not yet asleep. Vasily approached him, and pulling him by his leg, asked him in a whisper to get up and to come to him. Stepan stepped out of his bed and came up to Vasily. "Do me a kindness, brother," said Vasily. "Help me." "In what?" "I am going to fly from the prison." Vasily told Stepan that he had everything ready for his flight. "Tomorrow I shall stir them up." He pointed to the prisoners asleep in their beds. "They will give me away, and I shall be transferred to the cell in the upper floor. I know my way from there. What I want you for is to unscrew the prop in the door of the mortuary." "I can do that, but where will you go?" "I don't care where. Are not there plenty of wicked people in every place?" "Quite so, brother, but it is not our business to judge them. I am not a murderer, to be sure. I have not destroyed a living soul in my life. As for stealing, I don't see any harm in that, as if they have not robbed us. Let them answer for it themselves if they do. Bother them all. Suppose I rob a church, who will be hurt? This time I will take care not to break into a small shop, but will get hold of a lot of money, and then I will help people with it. I will give it to all good people." One of the prisoners rose in his bed and listened. Stepan and Vasily broke off their conversation. The next day, Vasily carried out his idea. He began complaining of the bread in prison, saying it was moist, and induced the prisoners to call the governor and to tell him of their discontent. The governor came, abused them all, and when he heard it was Vasily who had stirred up the men, he ordered him to be transferred into solitary confinement in the cell on the upper floor. This was all Vasily wanted. Chapter 9. Vasily knew well that cell on the upper floor. He knew its floor, and began at once to take out bits of it. When he had managed to get under the floor, he took out pieces of the ceiling beneath, and jumped down into the mortuary a floor below. That day only one corpse was lying on the table. There in the corner of the room were stored bags to make hay mattresses for the prisoners. Vasily knew about the bags, and that was why the mortuary served his purposes. The prop in the door had been unscrewed and put in again. He took it out, opened the door, and went out into the passage to the lavatory which was being built. In the lavatory was a large hole connecting the third floor with the basement floor. After having found the door of the lavatory, he went back to the mortuary, stripped the sheet off the dead body which was as cold as ice. In taking off the sheet, Vasily touched his hand, took the bags, tied them together to make a rope, and carried the rope to the lavatory. Then he attached it to the crossbeam and climbed down along it. The rope did not reach the ground, but he did not know how much was wanting. Anyhow, he had to take the risk. He remained hanging in the air and then jumped down. His legs were badly hurt, but he could still walk on. The basement had 2 windows. He could have climbed out of one of them but for the grating protecting them. He had to break the grating, but there was no tool to do it with. Vasily began to look around him and chanced on a piece of plank with a sharp edge. Armed with that weapon, he tried to loosen the bricks which held the grating. He worked a long time at that task. The cock crowed for the second time, but the grating still held. At last he had loosened one side, and then he pushed the plank under the loosened end and pressed with all his force. The grating gave way completely, but at that moment one of the bricks fell down heavily. The noise could have been heard by the sentry. Vasily stood motionless, but silence reigned. He climbed out of the window. His way of escape was to climb the wall. An outhouse stood in the corner of the courtyard. He had to reach its roof and pass thence to the top of the wall. But he would not be able to reach the roof without the help of the plank, so he had to go back through the basement window to fetch it. A moment later he came out of the window with the plank in his hands. He stood still for a while listening to the steps of the sentry. His expectations were justified. The sentry was walking up and down on the other side of the courtyard. Vasily came up to the outhouse, leaned the plank against it, and began climbing. The plank slipped and fell on the ground. Vasily had his stockings on. He took them off so that he could cling with his bare feet in coming down. Then he leaned the plank again against the house and seized the water pipe with his hands. If only this time the plank would hold. A quick movement up the water pipe and his knee rested on the roof. The sentry was approaching. Vasily lay motionless. The sentry did not notice him and passed on. Vasily leaped to his feet. The iron roof cracked under him. Another step or two and he would reach the wall. He could touch it with his hand now. He leaned forward with one hand, then with the other, stretched out his body as far as he could, and found himself on the wall. Only not to break his legs in jumping down, Vasily turned round, remained hanging in the air by his hands, stretched himself out, loosened the grip of one hand, then the other. Help me, God! He was on the ground, and the ground was soft. His legs were not hurt, and he ran at the top of his speed. In a suburb, Malania opened her door, and he crept under her warm coverlet, made of small pieces of different colors stitched together. 10. The wife of Peter Nikolaevich Sventisky, a tall and handsome woman, as quiet and sleek as a well-fed heifer, had seen from her window how her husband had been murdered and dragged away into the fields. The horror of such a sight to Natalia Ivanovna was so intense, how could it be otherwise, that all her other feelings vanished. No sooner had the crowd disappeared from view behind the garden fence, and the voices had become still. No sooner had the barefooted Malania, their servant, run in with her eyes starting out of her head, calling out in a voice more suited to the proclamation of glad tidings, the news that Peter Nikolaevich had been murdered and thrown into the ravine. The Natalia Ivanovna felt that behind her first sensation of horror, there was another sensation. A feeling of joy at her deliverance from the tyrant, who through all the 19 years of their married life had made her work without a moment's rest. Her joy made her aghast. She did not confess it to herself, but hid it the more from those around. When his mutilated, yellow and hairy body was being washed and put into the coffin, she cried with horror and wept and sobbed. When the coroner, a special coroner for serious cases, came and was taking her evidence, she noticed in the room, where the inquest was taking place, 2 peasants in irons who had been charged as the principal culprits. One of them was an old man with a curly white beard and a calm and severe countenance. The other was rather young, of a gypsy type, with bright eyes and curly disheveled hair. She declared that they were the 2 men who had first seized hold of Peter Nikolaevich's hands. In spite of the gypsy-like peasant looking at her with his eyes glistening from under his moving eyebrows, and saying reproachfully, "A great sin, lady, it is. Remember your death hour?" In spite of that, she did not feel at all sorry for them. On the contrary, she began to hate them during the inquest, and wished desperately to take revenge on her husband's murderers. A month later, after the case, which was committed for trial by court-martial, had ended in 8 men being sentenced to hard labor, and in 2, the old man with the white beard, and the gypsy boy, as she called the other, being condemned to be hanged, Natalia felt vaguely uneasy. But unpleasant doubts soon pass away under the solemnity of a trial. Since such high authorities considered that this was the right thing to do, it must be right. The execution was to take place in the village itself. One Sunday Malania came home from church in her new dress and her new boots and announced to her mistress that the gallows were being erected and that the hangman was expected from Moscow on Wednesday. She also announced that the families of the convicts were raging and that their cries could be heard all over the village. Natalia Ivanovna did not go out of her house. She did not wish to see the gallows and the people in the village. She only wanted what had to happen to be over quickly. She only considered her own feelings and did not care for the convicts and their families. On Tuesday, the village constable called on Natalia Ivanovna. He was a friend, and she offered him vodka and preserved mushrooms of her own making. The constable, after eating a little, told her that the execution was not to take place the next day. Why? A very strange thing has happened. There is no hangman to be found. They had one in Moscow, my son told me, but he has been reading the Gospels a good deal and says, I will not commit a murder. He had himself been sentenced to hard labor for having committed a murder, and now he objects to hang when the law orders him. He was threatened with flogging. You may flog me, he said, but I won't do it. Natalia Ivanovna grew red and hot at the thought, which suddenly came into her head. Could not the death sentence be commuted now? How so, since the judges have passed it? The Tsar alone has the right of amnesty. But how would he know? They have the right of appealing to him. But it is on my account they are to die, said that stupid woman, Natalia Ivanovna, and I forgive them. The constable laughed. Well, send a petition to the Tsar. May I do it? Of course you may. But is it not too late? Send it by telegram. To the Tsar himself. To the Tsar, if you like. The story of the hangman having refused to do his duty and preferring to take the flogging instead suddenly changed the soul of Natalia Ivanovna. The pity and the horror she felt the moment she heard that the peasants were sentenced to death could not be stifled now, but filled her whole soul. Philip Vasilievich, my friend, write that telegram for me. I want to appeal to the Tsar to pardon them. The constable shook his head. I wonder whether that would not involve us in trouble. I do it upon my own responsibility. I will not mention your name. Is not she a kind woman? Thought the constable. Very kind-hearted, to be sure. If my wife had such a heart, our life would be a paradise instead of what it is now. And he wrote the telegram to His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor. Your Majesty's loyal subject, the widow of Peter Nikolaevich Sventisky, murdered by the peasants, throws herself at the sacred feet. This sentence, when he wrote it down, pleased the constable himself most of all of your Imperial Majesty, and implores you to grant an amnesty to the peasants so and so, from such a province, district, and village, who have been sentenced to death. The telegram was sent by the constable himself, and Natalia Ivanovna felt relieved and happy. She had a feeling that since she, the widow of the murdered man, had forgiven the murderers, and was applying for an amnesty, the Tsar could not possibly refuse it. Chapter 11. Lisa Iropkin lived in a state of continual excitement. The longer she lived a true Christian life as it had been revealed to her, the more convinced she became that it was the right way, and her heart was full of joy. She had two immediate aims before her. The one was to convert Mahin, or, as she put it to herself, to arouse his true nature, which was good and kind. She loved him, and the light of her love revealed the divine element in his soul which is at the bottom of all souls. But further, she saw in him an exceptionally kind and tender heart, as well as a noble mind. Her other aim was to abandon her riches. She had first thought of giving away what she possessed in order to test Mahin, but afterwards she wanted to do so for her own sake, for the sake of her own soul. She began by simply giving money to anyone who wanted it, but her father stopped that, besides which she felt disgusted at the crowd of supplicants who personally, and by letters, besieged her with demands for money. Then she resolved to apply to an old man, known to be a saint by his life, and to give him her money to dispose of in the way he thought best. Her father got angry with her when he heard about it. During a violent altercation, he called her mad, a raving lunatic, and said he would take measures to prevent her from doing injury to herself. Her father's irritation proved contagious. Losing all control over herself and sobbing with rage, she behaved with the greatest impertinence to her father, calling him a tyrant and a miser. Then she asked his forgiveness. He said he did not mind what she said, but she saw plainly that he was offended, and in his heart did not forgive her. She did not feel inclined to tell Mahan about her quarrel with her father. As to her sister, she was very cold to Lisa, being jealous of Mahan's love for her. I ought to confess to God, she said to herself. As all this happened in Lent, she made up her mind to fast in preparation for the communion and to reveal all her thoughts to the Father Confessor, asking his advice as to what she ought to decide for the future. At a small distance from her town, a monastery was situated, where an old monk lived who had gained a great reputation by his holy life, by his sermons and prophecies, as well as by the marvelous cures ascribed to him. The monk had received a letter from Lisa's father announcing the visit of his daughter, and telling him in what a state of excitement the young girl was. He also expressed the hope in that letter that the monk would influence her in the right way, urging her not to depart from the golden mean, and to live like a good Christian without trying to upset the present conditions of her life. The monk received Lisa after he had seen many other people, and being very tired, began by quietly recommending her to be modest and to submit to her present conditions of life and to her parents. Lisa listened silently, blushing and flushed with excitement. When he had finished admonishing her, she began saying with tears in her eyes, timidly at first, that Christ bade us leave father and mother to follow him. Getting more and more excited, she told him her conception of Christ. The monk smiled slightly and replied as he generally did when admonishing his penitents, but after a while he remained silent, repeating with heavy sighs, "O God." Then he said, "Well, come to confession tomorrow," and blessed her with his wrinkled hands. The next day Lisa came to confession, and without renewing their interrupted conversation, he absolved her and refused to dispose of her fortune, giving no reasons for doing so. Lisa's purity, her devotion to God and her ardent soul, impressed the monk deeply. He had desired long ago to renounce the world entirely, but the brotherhood, which drew a large income from his work as a preacher, insisted on his continuing his activity. He gave way, although he had a vague feeling that he was in a false position. It was rumored that he was a miracle-working saint, whereas in reality he was a weak man, proud of his success in the world. When the soul of Lisa was revealed to him, he saw clearly into his own soul. He discovered how different he was to what he wanted to be, and realized the desire of his heart. Soon after Lisa's visit, he went to live in a separate cell as a hermit, and for 3 weeks did not officiate again in the church of the friary. After the celebration of the Mass, he preached a sermon denouncing his own sins and those of the world, and urging all to repent. From that day he preached every fortnight, and his sermons attracted increasing audiences. His fame as a preacher spread abroad. His sermons were extraordinarily fearless and sincere, and deeply impressed all who listened to him. Chapter 12. Vasily was actually carrying out the object he had in leaving the prison. With the help of a few friends, he broke into the house of the rich merchant Krasnopuzov, whom he knew to be a miser and a debauchee. Vasily took out of his writing desk 30,000 rubles and began disposing of them as he thought right. He even gave up drink so as not to spend that money on himself, but to distribute it to the poor, helping poor girls to get married, paying off people's debts, and doing this all without ever revealing himself to those he helped. His only desire was to distribute his money in the right way. As he also gave bribes to the police, he was left in peace for a long time. His heart was singing for joy. When at last he was arrested and put to trial, he confessed with pride that he had robbed the fat merchant. The money, he said, was lying idle in that fool's desk, and he did not even know how much he had, whereas I have put it into circulation and helped a lot of good people. The counsel for the defense spoke with such good humor and kindness that the jury felt inclined to discharge Vasily, but sentenced him nevertheless to confinement in prison. He thanked the jury and assured them that he would find his way out of prison before long. Chapter 13. Natalia Ivanovna Sventisky's telegram proved useless. The committee appointed to deal with the petitions in the emperor's name decided not even to make a report to the Tsar. But one day when the Sventisky case was discussed at the emperor's luncheon table, the chairman of the committee, who was present, mentioned the telegram which had been received from Sventisky's widow. 100 est très gentil de sa part, said one of the ladies of the imperial family. The emperor sighed, shrugged his shoulders, adorned with epaulets. The law, he said, and raised his glass for the groom of the chamber to pour out some Moselle. All those present pretended to admire the wisdom of the sovereign's words. There was no further question about the telegram. The two peasants, the old man and the young boy, were hanged by a Tartar hangman from Kazan, a cruel convict and a murderer. The old man's wife wanted to dress the body of her husband in a white shirt, with white bands which serve as stockings, and new boots, but she was not allowed to do so. The two men were buried together in the same pit outside the churchyard wall. Princess Sofia Vladimirovna tells me he is a very remarkable preacher, remarked the old empress, the emperor's mother, one day to her son. Fates l'avenir, il pute preacher à la cathédrale. No, it would be better in the palace church, said the emperor, and ordered the hermit Isidore to be invited. All the generals and other high officials assembled in the church of the imperial palace. It was an event to hear the famous preacher. A thin and gray old man appeared, looked at those present, and said, "In the name of God, the Son, and the Holy Ghost," and began to speak. At first all went well, but the longer he spoke the worse it became. Il devient de plus en plus aggressif, as the empress put it afterwards. He fulminated against everyone. He spoke about the executions and charged the government with having made so many necessary. How can the government of a Christian country kill men? Everybody looked at everybody else, thinking of the bad taste of the sermon, and how unpleasant it must be for the emperor to listen to it, but nobody expressed these thoughts aloud. When Isidore had said Amen, the metropolitan approached and asked him to call on him. After Isidore had had a talk with the metropolitan and with the attorney general, he was immediately sent away to a friary, not his own, but one at Suzdal, which had a prison attached to it. The prior of that friary was now Father Misael. Chapter 14. Everyone tried to look as if Isidore's sermon contained nothing unpleasant, and nobody mentioned it. It seemed to the Tsar that the hermit's words had not made any impression on himself. But once or twice during that day, he caught himself thinking of the two peasants who had been hanged, and the widow of Sventisky who had asked an amnesty for them. That day the emperor had to be present at a parade, after which he went out for a drive. A reception of ministers came next, then dinner, after dinner the theater. As usual, the Tsar fell asleep the moment his head touched the pillow. In the night an awful dream awoke him. He saw gallows in a large field and corpses dangling on them. The tongues of the corpses were protruding, and their bodies moved and shook. And somebody shouted, "It is you, you who have done it." The Tsar woke up bathed in perspiration and began to think. It was the first time that he had ever thought of the responsibilities which weighed on him, and the words of old Isidore came back to his mind. But only dimly could he see himself as a mere human being, and he could not consider his mere human wants and duties, because of all that was required of him as Tsar. As to acknowledging that human duties were more obligatory than those of a Tsar, he had not strength for that. Chapter 15. Having served his second term in the prison, Prokofy, who had formerly worked on the Sventisky estate, was no longer the brisk, ambitious, smartly dressed fellow he had been. He seemed, on the contrary, a complete wreck. When sober, he would sit idle and would refuse to do any work, however much his father scolded him. Moreover, he was continually seeking to get hold of something secretly and take it to the public house for a drink. When he came home, he would continue to sit idle, coughing and spitting all the time. The doctor on whom he called examined his chest and shook his head. "You, my man, ought to have many things which you have not got." "That is usually the case, isn't it?" "Take plenty of milk and don't smoke." "These are days of fasting, and besides we have no cow." Once in spring he could not get any sleep. He was longing to have a drink. There was nothing in the house he could lay his hand on to take to the public house. He put on his cap and went out. He walked along the street up to the house where the priest and the deacon lived together. The deacon's harrow stood outside leaning against the hedge. Prokofy approached, took the harrow upon his shoulder, and walked to an inn kept by a woman, Petrovna. She might give him a small bottle of vodka for it. But he had hardly gone a few steps when the deacon came out of his house. It was already dawn, and he saw that Prokofy was carrying away his harrow. "Hey, what's that?" cried the deacon. The neighbors rushed out from their houses. Prokofy was seized, brought to the police station, and then sentenced to 11 months' imprisonment. It was autumn, and Prokofy had to be transferred to the prison hospital. He was coughing badly. His chest was heaving from the exertion, and he could not get warm. Those who were stronger contrived not to shiver. Prokofy, on the contrary, shivered day and night, as the superintendent would not light the fires in the hospital till November, to save expense. Prokofy suffered greatly in body and still more in soul. He was disgusted with his surroundings and hated everyone: the deacon, the superintendent who would not light the fires, the guard, and the man who was lying in the bed next to his, and who had a swollen red lip. He began also to hate the new convict who was brought into hospital. This convict was Stepan. He was suffering from some disease on his head, and was transferred to the hospital and put in a bed at Prokofy's side. After a time that hatred to Stepan changed, and Prokofy became, on the contrary, extremely fond of him. He delighted in talking to him. It was only after a talk with Stepan that his anguish would cease for a while. Stepan always told everyone he met about his last murder and how it had impressed him. Far from shrieking or anything of that kind, he said to Prokofy. She did not move. "Kill me, there I am," she said, "but it is not my soul you destroy, it is your own." Well, of course, it is very dreadful to kill. I had one day to slaughter a sheep, and even that made me half mad. I have not destroyed any living soul. Why then do those villains kill me? I have done no harm to anybody. That will be taken into consideration. By whom? By God, to be sure. I have not seen anything yet showing that God exists, and I don't believe in him, brother. I think when a man dies, grass will grow over the spot, and that is the end of it. You are wrong to think like that. I have murdered so many people, whereas she, poor soul, was helping everybody. And you think she and I are to have the same lot? Oh no, only wait. Then you believe the soul lives on after a man is dead. To be sure, it truly lives. Prokofy suffered greatly when death drew near. He could hardly breathe. But in the very last hour he felt suddenly relieved from all pain. He called Stepan to him. "Farewell, brother," he said. "Death has come, I see. I was so afraid of it before. And now I don't mind. I only wish it to come quicker." Chapter 16. In the meanwhile, the affairs of Eugene Mihailovich had grown worse and worse. Business was very slack. There was a new shop in the town. He was losing his customers, and the interest had to be paid. He borrowed again on interest. At last his shop and his goods were to be sold up. Eugene Mihailovich and his wife applied to everyone they knew, but they could not raise the 400 rubles they needed to save the shop anywhere. They had some hope of the merchant Krasnopuzov, Eugene Mihailovich's wife, being on good terms with his mistress. But news came that Krasnopuzov had been robbed of a huge sum of money. Some said of 500,000 rubles. "And do you know who is said to be the thief?" said Eugene Mihailovich to his wife. "Vasily, our former yard porter. They say he is squandering the money, and the police are bribed by him. I knew he was a villain. You remember how he did not mind perjuring himself? But I did not expect it would go so far. I hear he has recently been in the courtyard of our house. Cook says she is sure it was he. She told me he helps poor girls to get married. They always invent tales, I don't believe it." At that moment a strange man, shabbily dressed, entered the shop. "What is it you want?" "Here is a letter for you." "From whom?" "You will see yourself." "Don't you require an answer? Wait a moment." "I cannot." The strange man handed the letter and disappeared. "How extraordinary," said Eugene Mihailovich, and tore open the envelope. To his great amazement, several 100-ruble notes fell out. 400 rubles, he exclaimed, hardly believing his eyes. "What does it mean?" The envelope also contained a badly spelt letter, addressed to Eugene Mihailovich. "It is said in the Gospels," ran the letter, "do good for evil. You have done me much harm, and in the coupon case you made me wrong the peasants greatly. But I have pity for you. Here are 400 notes. Take them and remember your porter, Vasily." "Very extraordinary," said Eugene Mihailovich to his wife and to himself. And each time he remembered that incident, or spoke about it to his wife, tears would come to his eyes. Chapter 17. 14 priests were kept in the Suzdal Friary prison, chiefly for having been untrue to the Orthodox faith. Isidore had been sent to that place also. Father Missel received him according to the instructions he had been given, and without talking to him, ordered him to be put into a separate cell as a serious criminal. After a fortnight, Father Missel, making a round of the prison, entered Isidore's cell, and asked him whether there was anything he wished for. There is a great deal I wish for, answered Isidore, but I cannot tell you what it is in the presence of anybody else. Let me talk to you privately. They looked at each other, and Missel saw he had nothing to be afraid of in remaining alone with Isidore. He ordered Isidore to be brought into his own room, and when they were alone, he said, "Well, now you can speak." Isidore fell on his knees. "Brother," said Isidore, "what are you doing to yourself? Have mercy on your own soul. You are the worst villain in the world. You have offended against all that is sacred." A month after Missel sent a report, asking that Isidore should be released as he had repented, and he also asked for the release of the rest of the prisoners, after which he resigned his post. Chapter 18. 10 years passed. Misha Smokovnikov had finished his studies in the technical college. He was now an engineer in the gold mines in Siberia and was very highly paid. One day he was about to make a round in the district. The governor offered him a convict, Stepan Pelajushkin, to accompany him on his journey. A convict, you say, but is not that dangerous. Not if it is this one. He is a holy man. You may ask anybody, they will all tell you so. Why has he been sent here? The governor smiled. He had committed 6 murders, and yet he is a holy man. I go bail for him. Misha Smokovnikov took Stepan, now a bald-headed, lean, tanned man, with him on his journey. On their way, Stepan took care of Smokovnikov like his own child and told him his story, told him why he had been sent here and what now filled his life. And strange to say, Misha Smokovnikov, who up to that time used to spend his time drinking, eating, and gambling, began for the first time to meditate on life. These thoughts never left him now and produced a complete change in his habits. After a time, he was offered a very advantageous position. He refused it and made up his mind to buy an estate with the money he had, to marry, and to devote himself to the peasantry, helping them as much as he could. Chapter 19. He carried out his intentions, but before retiring to his estate, he called on his father, with whom he had been on bad terms, and who had settled apart with his new family. Misha Smokovnikov wanted to make it up. The old man wondered at first and laughed at the change he noticed in his son, but after a while he ceased to find fault with him and thought of the many times when it was he who was the guilty one.